Hello children, in today's class we'll see the making of global world part 2 from history. And in the last class we have seen the first part that covers the topics such as the pre-modern world, and under that silk routes link the world, food travels, that is spaghetti and potato, and conquest, disease and trade. And next topic, the 19th century 1815 to 1914, and under that the topics were a world economic takes shape, then role of technology, and late 19th century colonialism, and winter pest or the cattle plague. So in today's class we'll see the remaining. Synopsis. The topics which are covered in this session are indentured labor migration from India, Indian entrepreneurs abroad, Indian trade, colonialism and the global system, the interwar economy and wartime transformations, next post-war recovery, and the last one, rise of mass production and consumption. Indentured labor migration from India. The example of indentured labor migration from India also illustrates the two-sided nature of the 19th century world. It was a world of faster economic growth as well as great misery, higher incomes for some and poverty for others, technological advances in some areas and new forms of coercion in others. Indentured labor means a bonded laborer under contract to work for an employer for a specific amount of time to pay off his passage to a new country or home. And here it has been said that the indentured labor illustrates two-sided nature of the 19th century. That is, on one side you can see faster economic growth, and the other side you can see great misery, because on the one side we are getting higher incomes, and whereas there are people who are suffering from poverty. So there were technological advances in some areas, and in some areas there were new forms of coercion in others. In the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Indian and Chinese laborers went to work on plantations, in mines, and in road and railway construction projects around the world. In India, indentured laborers were hired under contracts which promised return travel to India after they had worked 5 years on their employer's plantation. So most Indian indentured workers came from the present-day regions of eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, central India and the dry districts of Tamil Nadu. In the mid-19th century, these regions experienced many changes. Cottage industries declined, land rents rose, lands were cleared for mines and plantations. All this affected the lives of the poor. They failed to pay their rents, became deeply indebted, and were forced to migrate in search of work. Here you can see the picture of Indian indentured laborers in a cocoa plantation in Trinidad, early 19th century. Recruitment was done by agents engaged by employers and paid a small commission. Many migrants agreed to take up work, hoping to escape poverty or oppression in their home villages. Agents also tempted the prospective migrants by providing false information about final destinations, modes of travel, the nature of the work, and living and working conditions. Often, migrants were not even told that they were to embark on a long sea voyage. Sometimes agents even forcibly abducted less willing migrants. So here recruitment was done by agents and they were paid a small commission. And you could see that many migrants, they agreed to work because they wanted to escape from the poverty in their home villages. So they agreed to work. And what happens, the agents, they gave false information regarding their work, final destination, modes of travel, the nature of the work, living and working conditions. And 19th century indenture has been described as a new system of slavery. On arrival at the plantations, laborers found conditions to be different from what they had imagined. Living and working conditions were harsh and there were few legal rights. And this was the condition of those migrants. But workers discovered their own ways of surviving. Many of them escaped into the wilds, though if caught they faced severe punishment. Others developed new forms of individual and collective self-expression, blending different cultural forms, old and new. In Trinidad, the annual Muharram processions was transformed into a rituous carnival called Hosay for Imam Hussein, in which workers of all races and religions joined. And you could see here as laborers found conditions to be different from what they had imagined. So living and working conditions were harsh and they had no legal rights. So what happened? There are few workers who discovered their own ways of surviving. So many of them escaped into the forest wilds, and if they are caught, they'll be punished very severely. And others developed new forms of individual and collective self-expression and like blending different cultural forms, old and new. Similarly, the protest religion of Rastafarianism, made famous by the Jamaican reggae star Bob Marley, is also said to reflect social and cultural links with Indian migrants to the Caribbean. Chutney music, popular in Trinidad and Guyana, is another creative contemporary expression of the post-indenture experience. These forms of cultural fusion are part of the making of the global world, where things from different places get mixed, lose their original characteristics, and become something entirely new. Most indentured workers stayed on after their contracts ended or returned to their new homes after a short spell in India. Consequently, there are large communities of people of Indian descent in these countries. Have you heard of the Nobel Prize winning writer V.S. Naipaul? Some of you may have followed the exploits of West Indies cricketers Shiv Narayan Chanderpaul and Ram Naresh Sarwan. If you have wondered why their names sound vaguely Indian, the answer is that they are descended from indentured labor migrants from India. From the 1900s, India's nationalist leaders began opposing the system of indentured labor migration as abusive and cruel. It was abolished in 1921. Yet, for a number of decades afterwards, descendants of Indian indentured workers, often thought of as coolies, remained an uneasy minority in the Caribbean islands. Some of Naipaul's early novels capture their sense of loss and alienation. And this picture here shows the indentured laborers photographed for identification. For the employers, the numbers and not the names mattered. Next topic: Indian entrepreneurs abroad. Growing food and other crops for the world market required capital. Large plantations could borrow it from banks and markets. But what about the humble peasant? Enter the Indian banker. Do you know of the Shikaripuri Shroffs and Natakote Chettiars? They were amongst the many groups of bankers and traders who financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia using either their own funds or those borrowed from European banks. They had a sophisticated system to transfer money over large distances and even developed indigenous forms of corporate organization. Indian traders and money lenders also followed European colonizers into Africa. Hyderabadi Sindhi traders, however, ventured beyond European colonies. From the 1860s, they established flourishing emporia at busy ports worldwide, selling local and imported curies to tourists whose numbers were beginning to swell thanks to the development of safe and comfortable passengers vessels. As you can see here, in order to grow food and other crops, we need money. We need some capital. Large plantations could borrow it from banks and markets. But what about the humble peasant? So there comes Indian banker. And if you have heard about Shikaripuri Shroffs and Nautakotai Chettiars, so they were amongst the many groups of bankers and traders who financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia using either their own funds or they borrow it from the European banks. So they had a sophisticated, very comfortable system to transfer money over large distances. Indian trade, colonialism, and global system. Historically, the cottons produced in India were exported to Europe. With industrialization, British cotton manufacture began to expand, and industrialists pressurized the government to restrict cotton imports and protect local industries. Tariffs were imposed on cloth imports into Britain. Consequently, the inflow of fine Indian cotton began to decline. So as you can see here, fine cottons produced in India were exported to Europe, and when industrialization grew in Europe, what happened? The British cotton manufacture, it began to expand and they stopped importing cottons from India. So if they want to import any, what happened? Tariffs were imposed on cloth imports into Britain. So consequently, the inflow of the Indian cotton began to decline. From the early 19th century, British manufacturers also began to seek overseas markets for their clothes. Excluded from the British market by tariff barriers, Indian textiles now face stiff competition in other international markets. If we look at the figures of exports from India, we see a steady decline of the share of cotton textiles from some 30% around 1800 to 15% by 1815. By the 1870s, this proportion had dropped to below 3%. What then did India export? The figures again tell a dramatic story. While exports of manufactures declined rapidly, export of raw materials increased equally fast. Between 1812 and 1871, the share of raw cotton exports rose from 5% to 35%. Indigo used for dyeing cloth was another important export for many decades, and as you have read last year, opium shipments to China grew rapidly from the 1820s to become for a while India's single largest export. Britain grew opium in India and exported it to China, and with the money earned through this sale, it financed its tea and other imports from China. This picture here is the East India Company House in London. This was the nerve center of the worldwide operations of the East India Company. Here you can see a distant view of Surat and its river. All through the 17th and early 18th century, Surat remained the main center of overseas trade in the Western Indian Ocean. Over the 19th century, British manufacturers flooded the Indian market. Food, grain and raw material exports from India to Britain and the rest of the world increased, but the value of British exports to India was much higher than the value of British imports from India. Thus, Britain had a trade surplus with India. Britain used the surplus to balance its trade deficits with other countries, that is, with countries from which Britain was importing more than it was selling to. This is how a multilateral settlement system works. It allows one country's deficit with another country to be settled by its surplus with a third country. By helping Britain balance its deficits, India played a crucial role in the late 19th century world economy. Britain's trade surplus in India also helped pay the so-called home charges that included private remittances home by British officials and traders, interest payments on India's external debt, and pensions of British officials in India. So as you can see here, over the 19th century, British manufacturers flooded the Indian market. So food, grain and raw materials exports from India to Britain and the rest of the world increased. But if you see the value of British exports to India, it was much higher than the value of British imports from India. So thus Britain had a trade surplus with India. So this of Britain used this surplus to balance its trade deficits with other countries, that is with countries from which Britain was importing more than it was selling to. This is how a multilateral settlement system works. It allows one country's deficit with another country to be settled by its surplus with a third party. By helping Britain balance its deficits, India played a very crucial role in the late 19th century world economy. This map here shows the trade routes that linked India to the world at the end of the 17th century. Next topic, the interwar economy. The First World War 1914 to 18 was mainly fought in Europe, but its impact was felt around the world. Notably, for our concerns in this chapter, it plunged the first half of the 20th century into a crisis that took over 3 decades to overcome. During this period, the world experienced widespread economic and political instability and another catastrophic war. Wartime transformations. The First World War, as you know, was fought between two power blocs. On the one side were the Allies, Britain, France and Russia, later joined by the US, and on the opposite side were the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary and Ottoman Turkey. When the war began in August 1914, many governments thought it would be over by Christmas. It lasted more than 4 years. The First World War was a war like no other before. The fighting involved the world's leading industrial nations, which now harness the vast powers of modern industry to inflict the greatest possible destruction on their enemies. This war was thus the first modern industrial war. It saw the use of machine guns, tanks, aircraft, chemical weapons, etc. on a massive scale. These were all increasingly products of modern large-scale industry. To fight the war, millions of soldiers had to be recruited from around the world and moved to the front lines on large ships and trains. The scale of death and destruction, 9 million dead and 20 million injured, was unthinkable before the industrial age without the use of industrial arms. Most of the killed and maimed were men of working age. These deaths and injuries reduced the able-bodied workforce in Europe. With fewer numbers within the family, household incomes declined after the war. During the war, industries were restructured to produce war-related goods. Entire societies were also reorganized for war. As men went to battle, women stepped in to undertake jobs that earlier only men were expected to do. This picture here shows workers in a munition factory during the First World War. Production of armaments increased rapidly to meet war demands. The war led to the snapping of economic links between some of the world's largest economic powers, which were now fighting each other to pay for them. So, Britain borrowed large sums of money from US banks as well as the US public. Thus, the war transformed the US from being an international debtor to an international creditor. In other words, at the war's end, the US and its citizens owned more overseas assets than foreign governments and citizens owned in the US. Post-war recovery. Post-war economic recovery proved difficult. Britain, which was the world's leading economy in the pre-war period, in particular faced a prolonged crisis. While Britain was preoccupied with war, industries had developed in India and Japan. After the war, Britain found it difficult to recapture its earlier position of dominance in the Indian market and to compete with Japan internationally. Moreover, to finance war expenditures, Britain had borrowed liberally from the US. This meant that at the end of the war, Britain was burdened with huge external debts. The war had led to an economic boom, that is, to a large increase in demand, production, and employment. When the war boom ended, production contracted and unemployment increased. At the same time, the government reduced bloated war expenditures to bring them into line with peacetime revenues. These developments led to huge job losses. In 1921, 1 in every 5 British workers was out of work. Indeed, anxiety and uncertainty about work became an enduring part of the post-war scenario. Many agricultural economists were also in crisis. Consider the case of wheat producers. Before the war, Eastern Europe was a major supplier of wheat in the world market. When this supply was disrupted during the war, wheat production in Canada, America, and Australia expanded dramatically. But once the war was over, production in Eastern Europe revived and created a glut in wheat output. Grain prices fell, rural incomes declined, and farmers fell deeper into debt. Next topic, rise of mass production and consumption. In the US, recovery was quicker. We have already seen how the war helped boost the US economic trouble. In the years after the war, the US economy resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s. One important feature of the US economy of the 1920s was mass production. The move towards mass production had begun in the late 19th century, but in the 1920s it became a characteristic feature of industrial production in the US after a short period of economic. A well-known pioneer of mass production was the car manufacturer Henry Ford. He adopted the assembly line of a Chicago slaughterhouse in which slaughtered animals were picked apart from butchers as they came down a conveyor belt to his new car plant in Detroit. He realized that the assembly line method would allow a faster and cheaper way of producing vehicles. The assembly line forced workers to repeat a single task mechanically and continuously, such as fitting a particular part to the car at a pace dictated by the conveyor belt. This was a way of increasing the output per worker by speeding up the pace of work. Standing in front of a conveyor belt, no worker could afford to delay the motions, take a break, or even have a friendly word with a workmate. As a result, Henry Ford's cars came off the assembly line at 3-minute intervals, a speed much faster than the achieved by previous methods. The T model Ford was the world's first mass-produced car. This picture here shows T model automobiles lined up outside the factory. At first, workers at the Ford factory were unable to cope up with the stress of working on assembly lines in which they could not control the pace of work, so they quit in large numbers. In desperation, Ford doubled the daily wage to $5 in January 1914. At the same time, he banned trade unions from operating in his plants. Henry Ford recovered the high wage by repeatedly speeding up the production line and forcing workers to work even harder. So much so, he would soon describe his decision to double the daily wage as the best cost-cutting decision he had ever made. Ford's industrial practices soon spread in the US. They were also widely copied in Europe in the 1920s. Mass production lowered costs and prices of engineered goods. Thanks to higher wages, more workers could now afford to purchase durable consumer goods such as cars. Car production in the US rose from 2 million in 1919 to more than 5 million in 1929. Similarly, there was a spread in the purchase of refrigerators, washing machines, radios, gramophone players, all through a system of hire purchase, that is, credit repaid in weekly or monthly installments. The demand for refrigerators, washing machines, etc. was also fueled by a boom in house construction and home ownership, financed once again by loans. The housing and consumer boom of the 1920s created the basis of prosperity in the US. Large investments in housing and household goods seemed to create a cycle of higher employment and incomes, rising consumption demand, more investment, and yet more employment and incomes. In 1923, the US resumed exporting capital to the rest of the world and became the largest overseas lender. US imports and capital exports also boosted European recovery and world trade and income growth over the next 6 years. All this, however, proved too good to last. By 1929, the world would be plunged into a depression such as it had never experienced before. Okay children, by this session ends, and for your activity you have got write the importance of language and popular traditions in the creation of national identity. Okay children, the worksheet and the notes are given through PDF in the group. Kindly finish your classwork and the worksheet, and we'll see in the next class. Thank you.